It happened so quietly in the middle of a Sunday Mass that almost no one in the church realized, at first, that something had just shifted in a way that would later be impossible to forget, because when Father Daniel Brennan raised the Eucharistic host above the hands of a 9-3-year-old woman named Margaret Wan and then suddenly pulled it back, the entire rhythm of the moment broke without sound, without warning, and without explanation, leaving only confusion hanging in the air where certainty had been a second before. Margaret stood in front of him with her palms open exactly as she had been taught nearly 8 decades earlier in the same parish, her hands shaped by memory more than strength, her thumbs gently touching, her left hand cupping her right in a gesture repeated so many times it had become part of her body's language, while her shoulders remained small and slightly bent under a navy coat she had owned since the Reagan years, the same coat she had worn through winters, funerals, and ordinary Sundays that no one ever remembered until they stopped happening. Father Brennan did not place the host in her hand, and he did not place it on her tongue, and for a moment he said nothing at all, simply lowering the ciborium in a careful motion, like a man deciding not to continue something he had already started. And the silence that followed was heavier than words. Margaret looked up at him, confused but not afraid, tilting her head slightly the way elderly people do when they are trying to understand a sound that has lost its meaning, her lips moving without producing anything audible, as if the question itself had no permission to exist in the space between them. Then Father Brennan spoke her name softly, almost reluctantly, and said, "Margaret, not today," in a tone that was gentle but final, the kind of voice usually reserved for a child reaching towards something dangerous without understanding why it burns. Behind her stood Thomas Fawn, her son, seated quietly in the 4th pew, watching without moving, not stepping forward, not intervening, simply present in a way that already suggested decisions had been made before this moment ever arrived. Margaret did not turn around. She slowly closed her hands again, as if she were shutting a small, empty box that contained nothing she could retrieve, and lowered her gaze to the marble step she had knelt on for more than 60 years, a place that had absorbed decades of prayers, losses, and whispered names. Then, with a voice that was unexpectedly steady and clear, she said, "I am sorry, Father. I did not mean to interrupt," loud enough that even those in the 2nd pew heard it. Not as defiance, but as confusion wrapped in lifelong respect. She stepped back carefully from the altar rail, making sure not to lean on it, as if even in that moment she did not want to disturb anything sacred or fragile, and moved slowly toward the side aisle. A young woman behind her instinctively reached out to steady her, but Margaret gently refused, not out of pride, but out of a quiet desire not to cause embarrassment or discomfort to anyone around her. She returned to her pew, the 3rd from the front on the left side, the same pew where she had once sat beside her husband Edward Fawn for 51 years, the same pew she had never changed since the day they buried him in 2009. She knelt again with deliberate care, opened her rosary, and began to pray, restarting from the first bead because she could not remember whether she had finished or not, her fingers moving with practiced familiarity, even as her mind tried to find its place again. Around her, the Mass continued, the organ playing softly, the choir carrying the 2nd verse of "Soul of My Savior," while outside, a school bus passed, as if nothing inside the church had changed at all. But in the back of the church, in the very last pew on the right, an old man in a plain black cassock had quietly set his missal down and stopped moving entirely, watching her with a stillness that deepened with every passing second, as if he were waiting for the rest of the world to notice what he had already seen. From the back of the church, the silence was no longer just silence. It had weight, direction, and purpose, and the small old man in the black cassock remained perfectly still as his eyes stayed fixed on Margaret Wan for what felt like far longer than a moment should last, while the parish around him continued as if nothing unusual had happened. He had not blinked, not shifted, not looked away, and even Bishop James O'Hara, seated 2 rows ahead, felt the change before he fully understood it, as though the air itself had tightened behind him. The bishop turned his head slightly, already aware of the man sitting behind him, because he had served long enough to recognize when stillness was not absence of movement but presence of judgment. No one in the church spoke. No one reacted in a way that would break the surface of what was happening. The old man in the back pew did not yet stand, because he was waiting, not for permission, but for response, as if he needed to see whether anyone else in the parish would recognize that something required attention beyond routine. And when no one did, something in his posture changed, not visibly dramatic, but decisively internal, as if a line had been crossed that could not be ignored any longer. To understand what Father Daniel Brennan believed he was protecting that Sunday morning, it is necessary to step back to the Thursday before, to a meeting that, on the surface, was ordinary in every parish, the kind of conversation that rarely gets recorded because it feels too routine to matter. Father Brennan called it a pastoral conversation, held in a small office behind the sacristy, a room with a green carpet that had been installed the same year Margaret Juan's husband had died. It was not a formal hearing, not an official procedure, just a discussion that carried consequences no one fully named. Thomas Juan had driven in from Columbus that morning with his wife Carolyn. He was 64, worked in commercial insurance, and had not lived in Millbrook since 1981. His visits to his mother followed a fixed pattern. Every third Saturday he would arrive, take her to a diner, refill her pillbox, and leave by late afternoon, as if time with her had been measured and portioned like a responsibility rather than a relationship. Carolyn sat quietly beside him during the meeting, her purse resting on her knees, speaking very little, later admitting she had not fully understood what was being decided in that room. The parish secretary, Mrs. Helen Doyle, brought coffee in styrofoam cups and then remained to take notes at Father Brennan's request. Father Brennan began by explaining that Margaret Fawn had shown increasing confusion during the 10:30 Mass in recent weeks. He described moments when she had stood at incorrect times during the Eucharistic prayer, believing it was time to approach the altar. He mentioned once when she had whispered her late husband's name to a woman sitting beside her, a woman who had been in that same pew for over a decade but was not, in fact, Edward. Thomas leaned forward, prepared, composed, speaking with careful control. He said his mother no longer understood what was happening at the altar. He said the family had decided, out of love, that it was time to protect her dignity. He said they were arranging a transfer for the following Tuesday to Street, Mary's Memory Care in Dayton, where everything had already been prepared, paperwork completed, rooms secured, arrangements finalized. Then he asked the question that shaped everything that followed. He asked whether, on Sunday, it would be possible for Father Brennan to be discreet if Margaret came forward for communion, because the family did not want her to receive a sacrament she could no longer comprehend. He used the word sacrilege, and he repeated it. Father Brennan listened without interruption. He was 47, ordained for 12 years, known for being precise, controlled, and careful with time, the kind of priest who kept his cassock pressed and his homilies under 9 minutes. He respected Thomas Juan, who had contributed financially to the parish the previous year for the repair of the boiler, and that respect quietly shaped the tone of the room more than anyone admitted. When he finally spoke, he chose his words with the same careful certainty he would later repeat in the church. He said, "She no longer understands the sacrament, and that they were protecting her." Mrs. Doyle wrote it down exactly as he said it. No one in that room mentioned that Margaret Juan had once taught First Communion classes at Street, Bridget's parish, for nearly 5 decades, from 1962 until 2010, preparing approximately 900 children for their first Eucharist. No one mentioned that among those children had been a quiet 7-year-old boy in 1986 whose father had died in a steel mill accident only months earlier, a boy who had refused to attend class until a woman named Margaret Juan walked to his home 3 Wednesdays in a row, bringing pie and patience, and then walked him by the hand to the parish hall. That boy had been Daniel Brennan, and no one in the room considered that relevant. The meeting ended without signatures, because there was nothing formal to sign. Thomas thanked Father Brennan for his pastoral wisdom. Carolyn nodded. Mrs. Doyle gathered the cups. Outside, the bell of Street Bridget struck 11, the same bell Edward Fawn had once paid to repair in 1994, marking time in a way no one in that room acknowledged as anything other than ordinary. And 3 days later, on Sunday morning, everything that had been agreed in private would begin to unfold in public, in a way none of them were fully prepared to control. 3 days later, on Sunday morning, the church did not look different from any other Sunday, but what had changed was not the building. It was the way people inside it began to notice small things they would normally ignore. The small old man in the black cassock had already arrived early and taken his place in the last pew on the right, sitting with the stillness of someone who was not there to observe a ritual but to measure a situation. In the first 10 minutes of Mass, he noticed 3 things that did not align with how this parish usually moved through the liturgy. He saw Margaret Fawn in the third pew on the left, her lips moving in sync with the Confiteor, even though she was not following the Missal in her hands. He saw Thomas Wan in the fourth pew watching her sideways, not with open attention, but with a kind of controlled distance, like a man observing something he had already decided about. And he saw, when she stood for the gospel, that her right hand never left the rosary tucked inside her coat pocket. None of these details were loud or dramatic on their own, but together they created a pattern that could not be ignored once it had been seen. By the time the dismissal hymn began, the awareness had already started spreading through the parish in the quiet way rumors travel in small communities, not through direct statements, but through looks exchanged over styrofoam cups, through brief touches on sleeves, through silent questions that never needed to be fully spoken. Something had happened, something had been decided, and people were trying to understand what it meant without asking aloud. Margaret Fawn did not go to the parish hall afterward. Instead, she left through the side door that opened into a small garden where a statue of Street Bridget stood beside an iron bench. She sat there alone, placing her hands in her lap, the rosary already resting there as if it had always belonged there. She continued praying the sorrowful mysteries, as she always did on Fridays for her husband Edward, and on Sundays for whatever the day had taken from her without warning. There was no performance in her movements, only habit, memory, and continuity. Inside the church, the small old man in the cassock did not immediately follow her. He remained where he was, watching Father Brennan greet parishioners at the main door, observing how Thomas Wan shook the priest's hand and held it slightly longer than necessary, as if confirming something that had already been agreed upon elsewhere. Then, when the crowd began to thin, the old man stood and walked down the side aisle without urgency. Bishop O'Hara, who had been watching him quietly, rose as if to follow, but stopped when the man raised a single hand, palm down, not as a command, but as a boundary. The bishop understood and did not move further. The old man first went to the sacristy. Inside, Deacon Mark Riley was folding the corporal when he noticed him, and immediately froze. The deacon dropped the cloth without meaning to. The old man did not comment on it. He simply said, calmly and directly, that he needed the ledger of First Communion classes. The deacon nodded without speaking and went to the cabinet beneath the south window, retrieving 3 thick black binders, worn leather records kept long before digital systems existed. The old man opened the ledger covering the years 1980 to 1989 and turned to the spring of 1986. His finger moved slowly down the list of names, stopping at 22 children recorded that year. The third name was Daniel J. Brennan. In the adjacent column, marked Catechist, written in a careful, slanted handwriting, was the name Margaret E. Wan. The old man did not react outwardly. He simply closed the book with measured calm and asked his second question, "Who was the woman seated in the third pew on the left?" The deacon answered, not just with her name, but with her history. He spoke of Edward Fawn, the steelworker who had financed repairs to the bell and roof in 1994. He spoke of Margaret Fawn herself, who had once taught his own confirmation class. He mentioned that she had cleaned altar linens every Saturday for free until 2018, when her hip no longer allowed her to kneel comfortably by the washing machine. He said she still attended every Sunday at 10:30 Mass without missing a single week since her husband's funeral. His voice tightened slightly at the end, as if even saying it aloud made it more real. The old man asked where she was now. The deacon said she was in the garden, sitting on the bench she liked. Without further questions, the old man walked there. He did not announce himself. He simply sat down beside her on the bench, leaving space between them. Margaret turned her head slightly, noticing a man in a plain cassock with no visible insignia, no ring, no clear markers of authority. She asked if he was visiting. He said yes. She accepted that answer without suspicion. Then she adjusted her rosary in her hand, careful not to let it catch on her sleeve. The old man looked at the beads and saw how worn the third decade had become, smoother than the others, shaped by years of repetition. He asked if he could hold it. She placed it in his hand without hesitation. He turned it slowly, noticing the small crucifix, and on the back, faint but still visible, the initials EW 1958. He did not ask about it. He simply returned it and gently closed her fingers around it again, as if returning something far more personal than an object. He asked if he could sit with her. She said she was about to pray for her husband, but he was welcome to join her. So they prayed together, quietly, moving bead by bead through the third decade of the sorrowful mysteries. Her voice remained steady, familiar, unchanged. He followed her rhythm without interruption. When they finished, she said she was sorry because she could not remember his name. He smiled and told her it did not matter, and that she would remember it later. Then he stood, looked back toward the church where Father Brennan was returning toward the sacristy, and saw the bell tower above them, the same bell once repaired through Edward Wan's contribution, marking time again. He turned to Bishop O'Hara and gave a simple instruction that carried far more weight than its words suggested. The next Mass should not begin as planned. Instead, Father Brennan, Thomas Hahn, and Margaret Hahn should be brought forward together, and the ledger from 1986 should be brought with them. And with that, the direction of everything inside St. Bridget's began to shift toward a moment no one had yet fully understood, but everyone was about to witness. The 11:30 Mass did not begin on time, and the delay itself became the first quiet signal that something inside St. Bridget's had moved out of its usual order. Parishioners arriving for the second service found the doors already open, the lights still on, and a stillness in the nave that did not match the normal rhythm of a Sunday morning. At the center aisle stood the small old man in the black cassock, unmoving, not announcing himself, not explaining anything, simply present in a way that made people assume he was part of the liturgy that was about to begin. They entered, took their seats, and waited, unaware that what they were waiting for had already changed. In the parish hall, Bishop O'Hara found Thomas Wan finishing his coffee. The bishop did not raise his voice or add unnecessary words. He simply told Thomas he was needed at the front of the church. Thomas hesitated and said he had to drive his mother home within the hour, but the bishop replied that it would not take long. There was no pressure in the tone, only certainty, and that certainty left no space for refusal. In the garden, Margaret Juan was still seated on the bench when the bishop approached her. He spoke gently, telling her there had been a change and that she was being asked to sit in the front row for the next Mass. She immediately became concerned, asking if she was taking someone else's place, because even now, after everything, her instinct was not to disrupt, not to occupy space that did not belong to her. The bishop assured her it was her place for today. Only then did she allow herself to be guided. He helped her slowly through the side door, careful with her steps on the marble floor, and led her to the front pew, the one normally reserved for families during funerals. It was the closest row to the altar, a place of visibility and recognition rather than distance. He seated her there and remained beside her, not out of ceremony, but out of presence, as if unwilling to let her sit alone in what was about to unfold. Father Brennan emerged from the sacristy wearing his second set of vestments. The moment he stepped into the nave, he saw everything arranged differently than expected. The old man stood in the center aisle. The bishop sat beside Margaret in the front row. The deacon stood near the altar, holding the black ledger with both hands, as if it carried more weight than paper should. Father Brennan stopped at the altar step. Nothing was spoken immediately. The silence held until the old man finally broke it. He asked Father Brennan to come forward. Then he turned to Thomas Juan and asked him to do the same. Thomas rose slowly, adjusting his jacket, walking with the careful uncertainty of someone who has begun to realize that what he thought was a private decision has become public truth. The three men stood at the front, each in a different state of understanding, none fully aware yet of what the next words would require from them. The old man spoke directly to Father Brennan, asking a single question in a steady voice that did not rise or fall. "Who told you she forgot God?" Father Brennan hesitated, then responded with the explanation he had carried since Thursday. He repeated that Margaret no longer understood the sacrament, that her family had agreed, and that they were protecting her dignity. He said it clearly, almost rehearsed, as if repeating it would stabilize it. But as he spoke, the room shifted in perception. The phrase "Holy Father," which he used when addressing the old man, moved through the congregation like something heavier than words. People stopped whispering. Even breathing seemed to slow. The old man did not react to the title. He simply asked again, more precisely this time, who had made the decision that she did not understand. Father Brennan replied that it was her family, specifically her son, and that they had met and agreed together. The old man then turned to Thomas Juan and asked him directly when his mother had last prayed the rosary. Thomas answered uncertainly that she still carried it, but could not recall when she had last prayed it. The old man acknowledged this without comment, as if noting a gap rather than a conclusion. He then signaled the deacon, who stepped forward with the ledger. The old man opened it at the lectern in full view of the congregation and turned it so that Father Brennan could see. He asked him to read the third name. Father Brennan looked down and saw what he had not expected to confront in that moment: his own name, written decades earlier as a child receiving instruction, connected by a line of history he had not been actively remembering. Then the old man asked a second question, quieter but more direct. He asked who had taught Father Brennan the prayer he was now withholding from Margaret Juan. Father Brennan did not answer immediately. The weight of recognition was beginning to surface, not as emotion, but as sequence. The old man continued, asking who had first guided him to the altar when he received the Eucharist for the first time. At that point, Father Brennan's attention shifted slowly from the ledger to the third pew on the left, where Margaret had sat earlier that morning, and then to the front row where she now sat holding her rosary. Something in his expression changed, not suddenly, but irreversibly, as memory and present reality collided. The answer formed not as argument, but as admission. "She did," he said quietly, almost without realizing he had spoken aloud. The old man closed the ledger. The sound of it was soft but final. He stepped down from the lectern and moved toward the front row. The bishop instinctively reached out as if to assist him, but did not need to. He knelt directly in front of Margaret Juan, not as a figure of authority, but as someone acknowledging a truth that had been overlooked. He took her hands gently and asked her a question. She answered without hesitation, saying that her Jesus was waiting for her, as she had always believed. There was no confusion in her voice, only certainty shaped by decades of repetition and faith. The old man lowered his head for a moment, as if absorbing something he had long suspected but now had fully confirmed. Then he stood, returned to the altar, and prepared the Eucharist himself. No announcement was made. No additional explanation followed. He took the ciborium, stepped forward again, and placed the host before Margaret Juan, saying the words as they had always been meant to be said. She responded, "Amen," and received it in silence. Nothing dramatic followed. There was no reaction from the congregation beyond stillness, but something irreversible had settled into the space between them. The old man then turned toward the assembly and spoke, not as performance, but as instruction. What he said was simple and final. No one in this parish would be denied the sacrament based solely on assumptions made without personal understanding or direct relationship. Then he addressed Father Brennan privately, telling him to return to Margaret's home every week, to bring the Eucharist, and to pray with her, beginning with the same prayers she had once taught him as a child. And in that moment, what had begun as a decision made in a quiet office days earlier was no longer a private judgment, but a lesson unfolding in full view of the entire parish. Margaret Juan did not go to St. Mary's Memory Care on Tuesday. And by the following morning, the decision that had once seemed settled inside a small office at Street, Bridget's no longer existed in the same form because the paperwork that had been treated as final was quietly withdrawn, as if the certainty behind it had dissolved under the weight of what had been witnessed on Sunday. Carolyn Wan drove up from Columbus alone that morning and found Margaret in her small kitchen on Linen Street, the same house Edward had bought in 1958, where time had always felt slower and more layered than outside. They sat together, drinking tea, and Carolyn spoke very little. She did not try to explain or defend anything. She simply stayed, and in that silence, something softened between them that had not been present for a long time. Father Brennan came the following Tuesday. He did not come as a man defending a position or revisiting a decision, but as someone returning to a place he had once known without fully understanding it. He brought the Eucharist with him. He brought the stole he had been ordained in. He sat at Margaret's kitchen table, not in formality, but in humility, and prayed the rosary with her, beginning exactly where he had been instructed. With the third decade, he did not rush it. He did not shorten it. He followed her rhythm, bead by bead, as if relearning something he had once assumed he already understood. From that week onward, he returned every Tuesday. It became routine, not in the sense of obligation, but in the sense of restoration, as if something that had been interrupted had finally been allowed to continue correctly. He would sit with her, bring the sacrament, and pray with her in the same pattern she had taught children for decades, a pattern that now returned to its origin in a way no one had expected, but everyone eventually accepted. Inside Street Bridget's, the ledger from 1986 was placed in a glass case in the parish hall, next to a photograph of the bell repair funded by Edward Fawn in 1994. Beneath it, a small brass plaque was added with a single line, Margaret E. Wan, Catechist, 1962, 2010. She walked us to the altar. No further explanation was attached, because none was needed anymore. The record itself had become its own form of acknowledgement. The third pew on the left remained unchanged. It was not replaced, not reassigned, not repurposed. It simply remained as it had always been, carrying the memory of presence rather than absence. And years later, after Margaret Wan had passed away quietly in the same house, something unexpected was found resting on that pew on the first Sunday after her death. It was a rosary. The beads were worn smooth, especially the third decade, polished down by years of repetition, until they had the color and feel of something shaped by time rather than manufacture. On the back of the small crucifix were initials, faint but still readable, E.W. 1958. No one in the parish claimed to have placed it there. No one needed to. It was simply accepted as something that belonged, not because of where it came from, but because of what it represented. It remains there still, not as an object of display, but as a quiet presence. Morning light through the stained glass window above the side altar falls across it on Sundays, the same window Edward Juan had helped install years earlier. The light reaches the beads, rests on the worn third decade, and then fades as the day continues, as if marking time in a language the Church no longer tries to explain, only to remember.